Millionaire mocks a black mother on plane, until captain's emergency call reveals her identity. Angela Carter was not a woman who drew much attention to herself. She dressed modestly, kept her head down, and often seemed like just another passenger blending into the blur of airport crowds. To those who didn't know her, she might appear as an ordinary single mother, quietly tending to her 5-year-old son as they moved from one terminal to another. But behind her calm demeanor and worn leather handbag was a life that most people could never imagine. Angela had spent years in silence, gathering pieces of a puzzle that no one wanted to admit existed. She had learned to play invisible, to slip unnoticed into places where the powerful boasted about their deals, where records were hidden and voices silenced. She had trained herself to be patient, to let others underestimate her, because their arrogance was often the doorway to truth. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. Her son, the quiet child at her side, was her constant companion. To other travelers, he was just a boy clutching a toy car, gazing curiously at the world. But to Angela, he represented both a responsibility and a reminder of why her work mattered. He was the son of a man whose name was whispered in activist circles, a man who had dared to challenge corporate greed in West Africa and had paid the ultimate price. Angela had promised herself that this child would never grow up believing his father's voice was erased. On that crisp morning in Lisbon, as she boarded a transatlantic flight bound for New York, Angela looked like any other weary mother settling into first class. But tucked inside her handbag was more than a passport and boarding pass. She carried a miniature transmitter, a stack of encrypted documents, and a dossier that had taken 3 years to compile. For Angela, this flight was not about comfort or luxury. It was the final step in a mission that had consumed her every waking hour. Just a few rows away sat Edward Whitmore, a man who seemed born to occupy the best seat in every room. The CEO of Whitmore Global Resources was known for his gold Patek Philippe watch, his designer suits, and his ability to bend politicians to his will. His company's name appeared on glossy annual reports that spoke of progress and prosperity, but beneath the surface was a trail of broken communities, poisoned rivers, and graves that no one dared to count. Edward had built an empire on cobalt, the mineral powering much of the modern world, and he had done so with ruthless efficiency. For years, rumors had circulated about Whitmore Global's practices in Africa. Families displaced overnight, activists silenced under mysterious circumstances, villages left scarred by toxic mining. Yet Edward always walked free, untouchable in boardrooms and banquets, surrounded by those who admired his wealth more than they questioned his methods. He was the kind of man who laughed easily, but rarely with kindness. As the cabin filled with the soft hum of engines and the rustle of newspapers, Edward leaned back in his seat, his assistant Victoria Hale at his side. Passengers nearby smiled politely, eager to be seen in his orbit. And when his gaze drifted toward Angela, sitting quietly with her son, a smirk spread across his face. To him, she was an inconvenience, a disruption in a space he believed belonged only to people like him. Angela felt the sting of his dismissive glance but did not flinch. She had learned long ago that the world often judged her by her skin, her gender, and the child at her side. But she also knew that perception was her greatest shield. Edward saw a mother out of place in first class. He did not know the investigator who had infiltrated his empire, tracked his movements, and gathered the evidence that would dismantle everything he had built. The flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle, offering champagne and menus. Angela declined, keeping her focus steady. She adjusted her bag, ensuring the transmitter remained secure. Every detail mattered now, the clarity of the signal, the timing of her questions, the readiness of the team waiting on the other side of the world. She carried the weight of dozens of lives with her, lives cut short because of the man sitting a few seats away. What Angela could not reveal, not yet, was that she was not traveling alone in this mission. Hidden in plain sight was another ally, the man in the cockpit, Captain Daniel Ross, a retired intelligence officer who had traded military missions for commercial skies. To most passengers, he was just another pilot preparing for a long haul across the Atlantic. To Angela, he was the conduit, the one who would ensure that every word Edward spoke in arrogance would be transmitted far beyond the confines of the cabin. As the aircraft climbed into the clouds, the contrast between the two passengers became sharper. Edward Whitmore, basking in wealth and confidence, believed the world belonged to him. Angela Carter, quiet and unassuming, carried a secret that could turn his empire into rubble. The stage was set, though no one else on board could see it. To them, it was just another international flight, another routine crossing of oceans. But in the shadows of first class, power and justice were on a collision course. And by the time the plane touched down in New York, the laughter of a millionaire would give way to silence, and the world would know the truth. The first hour of the flight passed with the usual rhythm of long-haul travel, passengers adjusting their seats, flight attendants circulating with trays, the faint hum of engines carrying them steadily across the ocean. But in first class, something uglier was unfolding. Edward Whitmore's laughter cut through the calm like a blade. With his champagne glass raised high, he gestured openly toward Angela and her son. "First class is for people of our stature, not babysitters and their children," he sneered, his voice just loud enough for those around him to hear. The words carried the sting of centuries, a reminder of who was considered welcome in spaces of privilege and who was not. Several wealthy passengers chuckled nervously, eager to align themselves with Edward's authority. His assistant, Victoria Hale, smirked beside him, her silence an endorsement. Angela felt the heat of humiliation press against her skin, but she remained composed. This was not the first time she had been underestimated, and she had long since learned that silence was more powerful than outrage. Yet beneath her calm exterior, she was listening, watching, waiting. Every arrogant word Edward spoke was a potential weapon, every careless boast an opening. Edward, oblivious to the storm he was feeding, grew bolder with each sip of champagne. He leaned back in his seat, talking about his wealth, his influence, the ministers and presidents who owed him favors. He spoke as though the cabin were his stage and the passengers his audience. And when he noticed Angela's quiet gaze, he smirked again, convinced that his cruelty was entertainment. Angela did not rise to his bait. Instead, she carefully adjusted her handbag, checking the transmitter inside. The device was active, pulsing faintly as it captured every sound. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Ross was already relaying the feed through secure channels, transmitting Edward's words to Geneva, Washington, and Lagos. What seemed like drunken bragging to the passengers was, in fact, becoming a live confession to crimes the world had yet to fully uncover. The tension in the cabin thickened. Passengers glanced between Edward and Angela, some complicit in their silence, others uneasy but unwilling to intervene. Victoria, sensing danger in Edward's loosened tongue, tried to whisper cautions, but he brushed her off with a wave. His ego was too inflated, his arrogance too blinding. Angela leaned forward slightly, her voice calm and unassuming, as she asked questions that seemed innocent to anyone listening. But her words were calculated. Each question steered Edward closer to the truths he had hidden for years. She mentioned his expansion into West Africa, the speed at which communities were cleared to make way for mining, and the unusual silence of once prominent activists. And Edward, intoxicated by his own pride, began to boast. He chuckled about paying off foreign ministers, describing it as the cost of business. He spoke about leaders who resisted him, laughing that they never troubled anyone for long. His words grew darker, edged with a cruel pride that unsettled even those who had moments earlier laughed along. When Angela casually mentioned Samuel Okoro, a name that still carried weight among human rights defenders, Edward's pride cracked open completely. He smirked and said, "Samuel thought he could shut me down. Let's just say my security chief handled him permanently." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they had heard correctly. Victoria stiffened, her face pale as she realized the depth of what had just been said aloud. Angela's hand tightened around her handbag. The transmitter captured every syllable with crystal clarity, sending the admission across continents. In Geneva, prosecutors leaned forward in disbelief. In Washington, FBI analysts froze at their monitors. In Lagos, Samuel's widow wept as she heard the man who had ordered her husband's death laugh about it mid-flight. But Edward wasn't done. Drunk on his own power, he kept talking. He described the bribes paid to silence journalists, the villages displaced in the night, and the activists who disappeared when they threatened his profits. He reveled in the audacity of his empire, blind to the fact that his words were undoing everything he had built. Angela's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain steady. One wrong move could expose her too soon. She adjusted the device once more, ensuring the feed stayed clear. The passengers around her could feel something shifting, though they didn't yet understand. Edward's laughter, once a symbol of dominance, was beginning to sound like desperation. Victoria leaned closer, whispering urgently for him to stop. But Edward brushed her off, louder now, almost daring anyone to challenge him. The more he spoke, the tighter the noose became. Angela's patience was her weapon. She let him speak, let him bury himself under the weight of his own arrogance. Every confession, every cruel boast, was another nail in the coffin of his empire. She knew that by the time this plane landed, Edward Whitmore would no longer be a titan of industry but a criminal caught in the act of exposing himself. The passengers felt the unease growing. Some looked toward the crew, others avoided eye contact altogether. They didn't yet know that the captain himself was part of the operation, that their flight was no ordinary journey across the ocean. By the time the seatbelt signs lit up for turbulence, the cabin carried more than just the tremor of the skies, carried the weight of revelation. Edward Whitmore believed he was untouchable, but his own words were betraying him in real time. Angela sat quietly, her son leaning sleepily against her arm, unaware of the history unfolding around him. The plane surged forward through the night, each mile bringing them closer to New York, and closer to the moment when truth would finally eclipse arrogance. And as Edward poured himself another drink, laughing at his own audacity, Angela knew. The storm was coming, and he had no idea that he was standing in its center. The flight pressed onward through the night skies, the hum of the engines masking the storm building within the cabin. Edward Whitmore, flushed from champagne and pride, had no idea that his empire was unraveling in real time. Every word he spoke, every cruel laugh, every careless boast, was being carried thousands of miles across oceans, translated into legal language, and preserved as evidence that would shatter his untouchable facade. Passengers began to sense that something was terribly wrong. The man who had once commanded admiration now seemed grotesque in his arrogance, speaking of bribes and silenced activists as though they were stories at a dinner table. His assistant Victoria tugged anxiously at his sleeve, whispering urgent pleas to stop, but Edward brushed her off with an impatient wave. He believed he was in control. Angela Carter sat quietly, her son leaning against her shoulder, eyes closed in the innocence of sleep. She felt the weight of history pressing down on her. For 3 years, she had gathered fragments of truth, whispers in dusty villages, secret files passed under doors, testimonies from families who risked everything to speak. Now, here in the gilded cage of first class, the man responsible for so much suffering was destroying himself with his own arrogance. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady, though few realized the deeper meaning behind it. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be encountering some turbulence ahead. Please fasten your seatbelts. To the passengers, it was routine. To Angela, it was a coded signal. The transmission was strong, the evidence secure, and the prosecutors were already in motion. Edward lifted his glass again, smirking as if the world itself were his stage. He laughed about villages emptied overnight, about men who thought they could resist him and never returned. And then, in a chilling slip of pride, he admitted what Angela had been waiting for all along. With a cruel smile, he said that Samuel Okoro, the Nigerian activist whose voice had once echoed across continents, had been handled permanently on his orders. The air in the cabin grew heavy, suffocating in its silence. A few passengers turned sharply, eyes wide with disbelief. Others stared at the floor, unwilling to acknowledge the horror of what they had just heard. Victoria froze, her face drained of color. She knew there was no undoing those words. Angela's heart pounded, but her hands remained steady as she adjusted the transmitter once more. Across the Atlantic, in Geneva, the tribunal's chief prosecutor listened in real time. The confession was undeniable, unambiguous, and devastating. In Washington, FBI officials dispatched urgent calls to agents waiting at JFK. And in Lagos, Samuel's widow wept as the truth of her husband's death was broadcast into her home. The walls of Edward's empire were collapsing midair, though he remained blind to it. He reclined in his seat, arrogance dripping from every word, unaware that his freedom had already slipped from his grasp. Then Angela rose. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and unshakable. The passengers who had laughed at her earlier fell silent, watching with wide eyes as she reached into her handbag and pulled out a badge. The gold insignia gleamed under the cabin lights, unmistakable in its authority. "I am Angela Carter," she declared, her voice steady and resonant, lead investigator with the International Tribunal in Geneva. "For 3 years, I have been tracking the crimes of Whitmore Global Resources." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The quiet mother they had mocked, the woman they had assumed did not belong, had just revealed herself as the architect of Edward's downfall. She laid the dossier on the tray table, filled with documents, photographs, and encrypted files. One by one, she named the activists silenced by Edward's orders. 18 lives lost across Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone. Each name was a strike against the man who sat frozen in his seat, pale and speechless for the first time in years. And then she revealed the truth that shattered whatever arrogance he had left. The boy beside her, the child he had mocked, was not her son by blood. He was Samuel Okoro's orphaned boy, placed under her protection to keep him safe from the very man who had confessed to murdering his father. The sound of disbelief filled the cabin. Some passengers gasped, others covered their mouths in shock. Edward's laughter had vanished, replaced by the hollow silence of a man watching his empire burn. Angela's words cut like a blade. "You mocked a child whose father you ordered killed. You laughed at a family you destroyed. And now the world is listening." Edward lunged for the in-flight phone, his hands trembling as he tried to call his lawyers. But the line was dead. His offices in 4 countries had already been raided, his accounts frozen, his assets seized. News agencies were waiting, cameras primed to capture the fall of a man who had once been untouchable. For the first time, Edward Whitmore was powerless. His face drained of color, his body slumped in his seat as reality consumed him. The passengers stared, stunned at the reversal of power, at the sight of a billionaire reduced to nothing by the woman he had mocked. And yet the night was not over. Outside the cabin windows, faint shadows appeared against the moonlit sky, 2 U.S. Air Force jets flanking the plane, escorting it toward New York. The passengers whispered nervously, realizing that this flight was no longer ordinary. Edward sat frozen, trapped in a gilded seat that had become his cage. Angela's calm gaze did not waver. She had waited for this moment, not for vengeance, but for justice. The engines roared as the plane surged toward its destination. The stage was set for the final reckoning. And when the wheels touched the runway in New York, the world would witness the fall of Edward Whitmore. The descent into New York was unlike any landing the passengers had ever experienced. Through the windows, the city lights glittered like a sea of fireflies, But it was the pair of Air Force jets flanking their aircraft that kept everyone glued to the glass. The flight, once filled with arrogance and cruel laughter, had transformed into a vessel of justice. By now, every passenger understood that they were not simply on a plane, they were witnessing history. When the wheels touched down at JFK, the runway was lined with flashing lights. FBI vehicles, federal agents, and waiting news crews stood ready. The cabin grew tense, breaths held as the plane taxied to its gate. For the first time, Edward Whitmore sat in silence, his head bowed, his once glittering watch a hollow reminder of everything he was about to lose. The door opened, and agents flooded the aisle. They moved directly to Edward, pulling him from his seat in front of the stunned passengers who had once admired him. The cameras outside captured every step as the untouchable billionaire was led away in handcuffs. His assistant Victoria followed, her face pale, her career and freedom collapsing alongside his empire. The images spread across the world within minutes, headlines flashing across screens, broadcasters repeating the story of how a powerful man had been brought down midair by the very woman he mocked. Angela remained seated, her son's small hand clasped tightly in hers. She had no need to gloat, no desire for spectacle. For her, this was not about humiliation but about justice. Years of hidden work had come to light, and the weight of lives lost had finally been acknowledged. As she stepped off the plane, she walked with quiet strength, not as the ridiculed mother in first class, but as the investigator who had dismantled one of the largest corporate crime networks of her time. The trial in Geneva came swiftly. Edward Whitmore, stripped of his power and resources, faced charges that spanned continents. Testimonies, documents, and recordings, everything Angela had carried in silence, were laid bare for the world to see. For months later, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. His name, once associated with wealth and influence, became a symbol of greed, corruption, and downfall. Victoria Hale, his loyal assistant, received a 12-year sentence for her part in concealing his crimes. But the story did not end with their imprisonment. Angela used the seized assets of Whitmore Global to establish the Okoro Foundation, named for the activist whose death had once seemed invisible to the world. Through the foundation, pensions were created for the families of the 18 victims, and education funds were secured for their children. Samuel Okoro's son, the boy on the plane, was placed in one of New York's finest schools, where his future would no longer be determined by the cruelty of his father's enemies, but by the promise his father had once fought for. Edward's own family, long accustomed to lavish banquets and private estates, found themselves bankrupt, their wealth frozen, their influence erased. The man who once laughed at others' suffering spent his days in a prison cell, repeating bitterly, "How could a maid destroy me?" The irony was cruel but undeniable. He had never seen Angela for who she was, and that blindness became his undoing. Angela, however, did not dwell on Edward's downfall. Her focus remained on those who had been silenced, on the families who finally saw justice after years of grief. She was promoted to a senior role at the tribunal, her name now known across nations as the woman who had pulled back the curtain on corporate exploitation. But to her, the true victory was not recognition. It was restoring dignity to the lives Edward had tried to erase. The world watched, and for a moment, people were reminded of something often forgotten. That racism and arrogance, when combined with unchecked power, can destroy lives on a massive scale. Yet the quiet persistence of one underestimated woman showed that truth, patience, and courage could dismantle even the most fortified empire. And so the story of a black mother mocked in first class became far more than a tale of humiliation and revenge. It became a symbol of justice, of the hidden strength carried by those dismissed by society, and of the reckoning that awaits those who exploit the vulnerable. As viewers, the question lingers. How many more Edward Whitmores exist in our world today, untouched by accountability, thriving off the silence of others? And how many Angelas, quiet, underestimated, overlooked, are working even now, gathering truth, waiting for the moment when justice can no longer be ignored. Because in the end, this was never just a story about a flight from Lisbon to New York. It was a reminder that the fight for dignity, equality, and justice is happening all around us, often hidden in plain sight. So the next time someone is mocked, dismissed, or told they do not belong, ask yourself, are you witnessing weakness? Or could you be standing in the presence of someone who holds the power to change the world? You've just seen how one flight turned into a moment of reckoning, where arrogance and cruelty were shattered by truth and courage. Stories like this remind us how deeply racism and injustice cut, and how powerful it is when someone dares to stand up against it. If the story moved you, if it made you think or feel something, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss the next story we bring to life.